Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and I hope you're enjoying your Friday. And this is the kind of fifth kind of official Special Forces Week show that we've got our two Operation Whiting specials Saturday and Sunday, and we are looking at the Polish involvement with Commandos. So when it's Poland and it's World War II TV, we have a go-to guest, and you know who the go-to guest is, and it's Jennifer Grant, who has been on the show before talking about Sosabowski and Falaise Gap and various other things. So that's what we're talking about. So again, just a quick reminder, folks, if you're watching this and you're new to the channel, please click subscribe and please like the stream. The more likes, the more comments, it all helps with the algorithm. You have noticed I am starting to get more views now. Something has happened. So that's thanks to you and your patience and your support. So thanks for that. But right now I'm going to bring in Jenny, and we shall get talking about Polish Commandos. So good evening, Jenny. I won't ask how you are because you got a bit of a cold like last time.
Like last time, this is like the kiss of death coming on this show, honestly. So apologies for the husky voice, but there we go.
So, well, you know, it'll be fine. So, you know, we when we put our heads together and talked about Special Forces, at the beginning, you kind of thought there wasn't that much information about this unit, but in the end, you found quite a lot. So, it's lovely, I guess, when you're researching something new and you're finding out there's more stuff out there than you thought there was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the weird things, when we think in Special Forces, you're kind of thinking maybe a degree of confidentiality, secrecy. I suppose when we're talking about the Commandos, their role was very much as much about morale as actually their strategic achievements. So, you know, you can actually go into the British press, as I've been doing, and you get, you know, sort of journalists embedded with a sort of unit undertaking sort of training alongside them. And there's quite a huge amount actually about the sort of the Polish element. And I'll be referring to that later. So, yeah, if I just kick off and sort of describe where the Poles fit in the sort of the inter-allied commando element. So this is set up in 1942, possibly on the instigation of Mountbatten. And the idea is to create this specific unit that is made up of all the different national groups that are in exile in the UK. So you've got the Free French, you've got the Poles, you've got Yugoslavs, you've got the Belgians, and so forth. And the reason it's created is primarily to make use of the language skills. And
I thought you had language squirrels there. I thought that's a fantastic angle.
Language squirrels, yeah. And the local knowledge of the different national groups for commando raids. So like you have the French involvement in Dieppe, or the Norwegians in the Norwegian raids, and so forth. But there's also quite a lot of demand coming from the Allied armies themselves, because unlike, for example, the Navy or the Air Force, it's very, very hard for them to get into direct contact with the enemy. And for the Poles in particular, when, you know, they're sort of so brutally occupied by the Germans and the Soviets, it's particularly important. Troop 6 then. So we've brought this second slide up. So this is made up of soldiers from the 1st Polish Corps in Scotland. And as I always do, you kind of have to explain how the Poles get to the UK. So we're going to focus on their CO, which is Kapitan Mrakovsky. So if we have a look at his story, but his story isn't unusual. I mean, every time we tell this, every single Polish soldier, in order to reach the UK, has to show this huge amount of initiative and bravery. So this is kind of the self-selecting brilliance of the troops that arrive, which is possibly why the Polish troop is generally seen as one of the most successful. So Mrakovsky then, he is a professional soldier before the war. He fights in the September campaign. He's fighting on the Donets. He's then fighting as late as the 25th of September. So bearing in mind the Soviets have invaded from the 17th, and the armed forces that can have passed over the border. He's fighting to the 25th. He then crosses into Hungary on the 26th of September. So he's awarded the Silver Virtuti Militari for his role in the September campaign. He manages to then either evade internment or avoid it, and reaches Yugoslavia, sails to France. He then commands a regiment in May 1940 against the Germans. When the Poles finally sort of withdraw from France, he tries to cross the unoccupied zone, but he's shot in the leg. He manages to hole up then in Lyon, where they sort of patch him up. And then he crosses the Pyrenees on this injured leg. over to Gibraltar and then sails to the UK. And for his action in France, he's actually then awarded the Croix de Guerre and the Virtuti Militari. Now, it's quite hard in a lot of the records to get a sense of who he is. I mean, obviously he's particularly tenacious, but he's clearly extremely charismatic because he's then taken as part of the recruiting mission to the US. So this is the attempt to build up the Polish armed forces in the West by tapping into the large Polish community in America and in Canada and South America to a lesser degree. So he's part of this recruiting mission. And then when we get to August 1942, then he is appointed as what the Poles call the First Independent Commando Company and what the British refer to as Troop 6 of the 10th Inter-Allied Commando. So this is where it all kind of starts.
So just to interrupt, because I like interrupting, and it gives you a break. Because one of the recurring themes this week has been, how do leaders of special forces get there? You know, what other qualities you have to have? You know, resourcefulness and ability to organize. And you know, you've already listed the qualities of he's escaped from a country, he's gone through numerous countries, he's survived with being wounded, and that sense of being behind the lines, which is the nature of being a special force, but also this idea of it galvanizing Polish opinion around the world, because there are Poles in pretty much all the Western countries watching what's going on, looking at how Poland's countrymen around the world are reacting to the war. So this is the story of special forces. It's, as you said at the beginning, it's a combination of actually going out and blowing up things and a propaganda message and a message to the enemy of, we are going to bring all these different types of people to go and get you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Poles, I mean, they have got very much an eye to the propaganda element, because obviously this commando troop isn't the only sort of special forces, if we use that sort of term. And, you know, you've got the Cichocemni, who are sort of dropping into occupied Poland. The parachute brigade that's forming under Sosabowski contains lots and lots of elements that we'd see of special forces training. If you type in Polish Commandos, actually, one of the big things that comes up from 1943 is Polish Girl Commandos. So you've got sort of women sort of undergoing commando training as well. But obviously this commando unit is really special, and a huge deal is made of it in the British press. So we just move on to the next slide. I'm going to try this. We've got a group of them here, and there's amazing photographs from Italy on the Polish archives. So this multinational organization, then, you've kind of got these two problems that it faces, and the British press acknowledge one of them, which is, how will all these different nationalities who are stationed together and trained together to a degree, well, certainly they do exercises together, how will they cope? So, as I say, there's a degree of sneeriness, which is all these sort of men with different languages, different cultural values, different strategic objectives, you know, and you kind of get this impression of, you know, is that, oh, they're all funny foreigners, how will that get? But then you've also got that forceful personality that comes through. So, like, you know, they set up things like the club that opens in Harlech. So they begin out in Wales, and it's called, it slightly cringe, the Melting Pot, for example. You've also got like administrative challenges, which is like the orders would be given in English, and then would be translated by one of the national officers. The roll call is done, and you can just imagine the sort of pronunciation challenge, where you've got everything from sort of Norwegians to the sort of the Flemish through to the Poles. And then obviously the fact that they're in Wales sort of compounds this, because then you've got the Welsh accent and Welsh language. It's like the poor Poles that end up in Scotland and have to sort of speak Gaelic to some of the farmers and so forth. And one of the really interesting things about the Inter-Allied Commando is that it explicitly wants to preserve the national identity. So whereas elsewhere you're looking for sort of coherence and alignment, here they're wanting that national identity to be kept so that they sort of actively foster that. So there's this great article I found. It's called The Singing Commando from 1943. And it describes this commando unit as like the League of Nations, but obviously famously the League of Nations doesn't have an army. It's like a small League of Nations, but armed to the teeth. And despite all their differences, they are united by having the Green Commando Beret and this sort of unparalleled fighting efficiency. And then it goes on to sort of list their different sort of characteristics. So the French are described as having like lively wit, which isn't the impression you actually get if you read it. I mean, there's one sort of particularly hard case who's just got pas de chance sort of etched across his forehead and things, you know. But okay, the Norwegians are very sort of Scandi-noir, so they have grim determination. And the Poles are just out there. So I'm just trying to sort of, they are praised for their boisterous imagination and somewhat exuberant gaiety. So there's quite a lot of drinking. One of the things, and I don't see this in any other records elsewhere, so I think this might be their sort of commando thing passing as a national tradition, is they would greet sort of British officers by sort of throwing them up in the air and so forth. So, but on the other side, you kind of see that element where you get that sort of Polish myth making, like the 303, where they're reckless and sort of, you know, knights of the sky. But if you think about 303, for example, actually their losses were significantly less in proportion to their kills. And we see this again with the Poles. So although they are supposed to break into song at any given moment, I swear they had an accordion with them. They're also praised for being probably the tightest on military etiquette and drill, for example. So we've got that kind of element. But I suppose the big challenge is not so much the different nationalities. Thank you. It's not so much the different nationalities as that relation of the sort of the chain of command, which is they are under British command ultimately. So although the Poles refer to them as like the Independent Commando Company, for the British they are Troop 6. And it's quite interesting because we've actually got this letter of them thrashing out the sort of administrative areas of sovereignty between Mountbatten and Sikorsky from August 42. So it's things like they would have a Polish officer, but the whole commando would be under a British officer, Colonel Lister. The Poles are welcome to come and inspect them at any time. They are expected to wear the commando badge, but everything else related to uniform is at the discretion of the Poles, for example. They would receive British equipment, but they could have their own drills. So you've got all of this negotiation. And this is one of, this is my area of research. It's all of these little bits that have to be negotiated for every single service we see being carried on here as late as 1942. So one of the big concerns then is also this fear, although we talk about like the United Nations, we talk about, sort of the allies, they all have their own strategic objectives. And one of the concerns we see as early as 1939 is that these units under British command will be used to further British strategic objectives. So, for example, they'd be sent out to the Far East to defend British concerns there and so forth. So the Poles are absolutely adamant from the outset. And again, we see this when they're negotiating sort of the Polish Air Force, that they would only be used in Western Europe against the Germans. So if we just move on to the next slide here. Oh, I came across this brilliant YouTube video. It's about 5 minutes long, and I think it's designed for Polish troops. So if you sort of type this in, Szkolenie Polskich Commandosów, oh, here we are, sort of, and Carnarvon. So there's kind of three. I was just going to move on and start talking about their training, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just interrupt again, just to give you catch your breath again. Is that again the theme this week has been in that early sort of 41, 42, 43 period. The whole special forces idea is changing week by week. You're seeing this from this integration of the Poles within the British army. But the British Army, well, the Commonwealth forces are still not quite sure what they're doing with special forces. Forces are being raised. Their name is changing 1 week. You're recruited 1 week under one organization, but 2 weeks later, when you actually get posted to a unit, it's changed its name again and the commanding officer has changed. So, everybody is trying to work out what to do with these special units because, as we established at the beginning of the week, they really weren't special units in 1939. Then suddenly, like buses, dozens have come along in 42, 43. and it's a bit of a process to work out, okay, now we've got them now, what are we going to do with them and where are we going to send them? So it's fascinating that by 44, 45, when we get to that, a bit like, well, we could stop it in 44, things have got a bit more organized. But that early period, I think, is really fascinating.
I mean, it's really interesting to say that, because as I say, I'm going to be talking about when they transfer over to Polish Command. And again, they have about 4 different placements, because, the Poles, they're relatively new as a concept. So it's how they make use. So, it's really interesting to hear about sort of the British perspective there, because it certainly plays out with the Poles of how do we actually use them. So they're training them. I'm not going to bore your viewers who presumably know all about commando training. But there's kind of 3 geographical locations for where this takes place. First one is in Wales. So they're originally in a sort of Fairborn, and then they moved to Carnarvon in February 1943. So you've got Carnarvon Castle on the left there, which is so cool. I went when I was 7. I still remember it. It was so you've got this great film of the Poles in Carnarvon. And you see them sort of visiting the castle and sort of meeting up with women. There's this shot here. I do apologise for the graininess. This is Mishka, who's their tiny little poochie dog. And obviously, Mishka's on the table drinking from their pint glasses because, small dog, lots of beer. This isn't going to end well. But OK. And then you get this amazing sort of footage of them actually sort of training. So I'll move on to that in a second. So after Wales, then they are, once they're sufficiently trained, they're moved up to the irregular warfare training up at Aknakari. So they're there for a few weeks. And then May 1943, they're brought down to Eastbourne. The whole of the sort of inter-allied commandos brought down to Eastbourne for final sort of training, but before they're all sort of sent in their different directions. So I've been really, really fortunate. I've been in contact with the Pilsudski Institute in New York, and they were happy for me to sort of use their photographs. So I'm just going to sort of talk through these. So obviously it's a very, very long day, long intensive training. So you begin with your sort of PT. So we have them here sort of leaping and rolling. We've got them racing. And then we've got, so obviously your sort of training takes sort of 4 forms. So you've got your sort of tactics, your skill at arms, your demolitions, and your close quarter battle. So we see them here. One of the things they would do, obviously, is use live ammunition. So when they're sort of practicing their landings, their night landings, you'd see sort of columns of water sort of shooting up around them. You can see that a little bit in the film. You can see them here sort of bringing the boats. They sort of practice with a number of sort of different crafts. We've got a whole range of guns. You've got sort of 1 Piat per troop, for example. So you're using not just sort of British weapons, but they learn how to use sort of enemy weapons as well. We see them here again and here. And then they're wild keen on rock climbing and abseiling. I mean, they spend every living moment up and down things with sort of rope craft here. We can see here, now I've been in contact, I don't know if Eric's actually online here, is talking about his father and his uncle actually served in this unit. And this is either his father or his uncle, which is pretty special.
Wow.
And then if we just sort of leave it there then. So just a final bit on the sort of the training then. A lot of these men had already gone through the fairly intensive sort of the parachute training under Sosabowski. So he'd set up this kind of assault course, the Monkey Grove, which was really sort of physically demanding. So a lot of them had sort of passed through that as well. I found another report in 1945. So this is Ramsgate Council. And they're putting in a request for funds for repairs because their swimming pool had been bombed during the war, but it also then been shot up by the Poles who were doing live arms training around this swimming pool, which is pretty cool. So that kind of brings us through to when the Poles are kind of ready to then go into action. They've had these 3 stages of training. They've been sort of trying to sort of break into Arundel Castle at night and all sorts.
But just to ask you a question.
Yeah.
In your research so far, has there been anything specifically Polish about their training? Or it looks to me as this is the same commando training they're giving the Dutch, the Norwegians, the British, and everybody else. It's a generic but very, very tough commando training. There's no hint yet there's any kind of sense that they're going to use them for something that will specifically need their Polishness?
No, and I think this is one of the kind of the mysteries, because actually if you look at the numbers, there are far more Poles in the military in the UK than any other troop, and yet you end up with like 2 French troops and just the 1 Polish one. And presumably that's a kind of a decision about resourcing, which is, you know, we're far more likely to need French speakers in France than we are Poles over there, where we can sort of barely reach. So I think that's kind of why we only end up with this 1 troop. There are obviously differences. I mean, some of the troops are better than the others, but yeah, it's fairly, I would sort of say, standardized training in that sense, coming from the top.
But do you know, think of as any of the Polish commanders themselves, or their officers, are ever kind of suggesting possible missions that could have a Polish focus? You know, because, you know, when we go back to the first show we did on Monday about the first Special Service Force in America and Canadians, now Colonel Frederick there, okay, he's a colonel, later a general. He's specifically going to the US War Department and saying, I've got an idea for them to be doing this. You know, I mean, I guess with the smallish number we're talking about with the troop there, they haven't really got the clout or the rank to take any ideas up to a higher level.
No, at this stage then, I mean, 43, the only real sort of viable area for them is the Italian campaign, which is where they're going to get sent. So they're going to get sent to Italy, not under Polish command, actually, which is a really sort of interesting element until later. Later then, once we get to sort of beginning of 1944, and again, you keep anticipating all my points here. It's very annoying. They're going to actually put in a request to be transferred back to the UK so that they can take part in D-Day and so forth. But that's actually denied. So they end up remaining in Italy. So yeah, I mean, you say it's quite small. It's under 100 men here. But yeah, so they contribute through the Italian campaign, which is pretty much the only way they can have direct contact with the Germans at this stage. Yeah.
Well, I'll shut up. And Eric is watching, by the way. But yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, and I love in general being part of something that is, as I said at the beginning, essentially new research. You know, I mean, I've got a thin little Osprey book on the Inter-Allied Commando, and I think there's 2 paragraphs on the Poles. Basically says there were some. Move on. Basically, is what it says. Yeah. So you know, it's not much information, but it's fascinating that again the propaganda idea of using all these different nations is so good for the image, and it goes back to what we were talking about with Alan Allport last year about this Britain standing alone nonsense. Really is a ridiculous trope. I don't know why it endures. You know, Britain was standing there in 42, 43 with all these other people within the British Isles who all were aiming for the same result, which is the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Japanese. So yeah, it's just incredible there was all these people part of it. But I'll hand it back to you, and I won't interrupt anymore for a while.
No, do absolutely, it's fine. So I'm going to just move on to our next slide then. So we're going to get to Italy. So September 1943, the Poles and the Belgians and a handful of Yugoslavs, and then I think a few from X-Troop are sent through. And they sail and arrive in Algeria. Now, there's a nice, specifically Polish element, which is they actually run into some Polish women and children who had come through the Siberia route and through the sort of the Anders army. And these were the first sort of Polish women and children a lot of them had actually seen, and they sort of celebrate Polish Mass together and so forth. Because I think one of the key things, I mean, I'm trying to bring this out through my research, is they're not just a military unit. They are in exile and they have come through trauma, and at all points their families are back home and they no idea what is going on. So any contact you find, or you see things with like the Carpathian Brigade where they meet these Polish Jewish tailors in North Africa, for example, and just that sort of comfort of feeling at home with people of sort of similar cultures, so important, and it just comes through with all of these connections. But yeah, so the in Algiers, and then they get posted to Taranto. So anybody who's not familiar, if you're imagining kind of your boot of Italy, Taranto is just at the sort of the top where the sort of the heel meets the boot, as it were. And then they pass under General Dempsey's command. And the idea is that the Poles and the Belgians will develop, gain sort of experience here. they're going to be sort of patrolling around the sort of the Sangro River and sort of practice infiltration. So it's much more of an experience gaining. This is very, very mountainous area. It's quite thinly held, so it's sort of just practice really in that sense. So December 1943, they move into the line here. Now they're not put under, sorry, they're under the command of the 56th Reconnaissance Regiment. So they move from the regiment to HQ at Capricotta to this place here, which is Pesco Penetaro, which is on the north. And the poor Belgians get the sort of the sticky end of the lollipop. They end up at San Pietro Avellana. Now, the Germans had sort of bombarded both of these villages. But as you can see, you've got mainly sort of roofs missing. It's not too bad at Pesco Penetaro. The poor Belgians have got nothing. They end up sort of in their sort of tents next to walls, and particularly when the snow is going to come. So this used to be a ski resort. On their first day, the Poles send out this patrol. So they go down to the Sangro River. They encounter their first Germans having crossed the river. And senior rifleman, the Polish rank doesn't really sort of translate. Franciszek Rogucki gets shot in the thigh. He's then, obviously, they're relatively isolated at the bottom of the valley. He's then brought back up the hill by Lieutenant Chindits, who then gets Silver Cross Virtuti Militari for this. Now, Rogucki's a really interesting one. So he's actually from Pittsburgh originally. He's a Polish-American. His Polish is pretty shonky, and you get that with quite a lot of the Polish Americans. It's sort of second generation. But their identity is really quite significant. And I think we get the impression his mother, certainly the story is his mother sort of pressured him to join the Poles. And this, a lot of the time, they're joining the Polish unit in Scotland, not knowing the language, and before America has even entered the war. So kind of got that sort of Polish calling there. Now, sadly, he then dies of his wounds. Now, if we move on to the next slide then. Here, now again, some grainy footage, but again, I found this sort of little bit of film footage here. If you type in Poland Commandos in Pesco Penetaro. So you get a real sense in the left-hand one, if you can kind of make it out. They're up there with their mule trains coming through sort of the damaged buildings. On the right, I know you have to really squint and want this one. You can see them, the Poles actually kneeling. Now, this is actually the funeral of Rogucki. You can see the crosses in the back of German graves. But you can actually sort of see his funeral taking place. So this is a real sort of powerful piece of footage that's just out there on YouTube, which is quite cool. So the next time they really see action is the 20th of December. So an Italian man comes to Capricotta, and he says the Germans have asked him to serve as their guide. He's clearly turned. Their aim is to take out the Polish position and then proceed and take out the British field guns. And the Poles then go and sort of dig in. So at 8 p.m., they are then surrounded. They're attacked by a number of these sort of German, highly specialized mountain troops. And they hold out for 9 hours until the Germans retreat. So they're outnumbered 2-1. And they get away relatively lightly. Only 3 of them are sort of wounded. And because of this intense battle, Mrakovsky actually then gets the military cross. So if I have a quick read of his citation here to give a sense of, the sort of the man we're dealing with here, it says, his example, his complete disregard for his personal safety, and his absolute control of his troop throughout the whole night undoubtedly contributed largely to its success in driving off the attack, in spite of being outnumbered 2-1. Okay, so that's 20th of December. Now, if the winter kind of comes in a little bit. Okay, we've got these stunning photos here again from Polish archives, and again, it's a beautiful photograph. You've got your sort of long wintry, shadows and so forth. But a couple of things to point out. It's a striking photograph because it's black against white, which, if you're thinking about it in a combat zone, is not really ideal. And one element is that the supplies just haven't come through. So it's not going to be until really we get to the spring that they get the white clothing. And then the books kind of disagree on whether that's they kind of make do and negotiate a sort of local deal to get these Italian sort of funeral robes, or it's that the winter supplies come through legitimate channels. You can also see that actually the snow's relatively deep. This is a ski resort. These are the Poles. They're expert skiers. They're kind of born zipping up and down, Zakopane. They've actually got a sort of internationally competitive skier. The skis don't come through. The Belgians get them. Now, I don't know if you've noticed the sort of Belgian medal tally in the Winter Olympics, but it's not great, is it? So
Belgium is pretty flat. I mean, not that having mountains necessarily means you can't ski without man. You can travel, but but that's just the vagaries of how the army works. Why does the short guy always get the biggest weapon? So it would just seem, I don't think there's any slight there. That's the way the army works. The skiers go to the non-skiers and the skiers don't get them. That's everybody's been in the military just going, that's how it works. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's more that the Belgians, they sort of stumble across these in one of the houses and so forth. And then the Poles, actually, they have to go to the mayor and negotiate with him, and he's able to sort of rummage through again. So, so we end up with the Poles eventually getting their skis. So let's have a look. Yeah. And then we get this snowstorm hits and they're entirely cut off. So you end up with Bakleda, who is this sort of international skier, zips down to Capricotta on his skis and asks for an airdrop. And at this point, they decide to just sort of pull them out of the line, really. But one piece of information that they're very, very keen, it's recorded in the books that I've been reading, is if your mule gets stuck in a snowdrift, and this is for, when we get to the apocalypse, you can't just pull your mule out. You have to dig out every single individual leg, and then it's freed. So I'm just passing this Polish wisdom.
You heard it here, folks. Folks. There's your bit of apocalypse advice from Jenny there. Always dig your mule or ass's legs out in a snowdrift. I feel I'm a bit more armed now for the forthcoming events of the world. Yeah, great.
Yeah. Cool. No, absolutely. Rat kebabs and sort of snowdrifts. We're good. Okay. So they're now transferred to the 56th London Division, and they're now on the front line here. They're crossing the sort of Garigliano River. They then sort of begin to sustain quite significant casualties. So one of the first things they do, they cross the river, and the sort of the white strips that are set out to indicate sort of minefields kind of run out, and we get some injuries there. They're trying to take this town called I don't know how your Italian is. Suggio, I think it is. Sujo. Suggio. That's all I could find. And this is where we get sort of proper close quarter fighting. And you've got sort of sheer rock face. We've got the use of the knives. We've got grenades and so forth. And you've got 4 Poles die in this incident, but they managed to clear this valley of Germans. And also there's this brilliant moment. So you've got senior rifleman Braulinski, so his Tommy gun jams. So obviously, rather than just going and hiding behind the nearest sort of orange tree, for example, he charges at the German position shouting, and they surrender to him, which is pretty damn ballsy, I think.
Yeah.
Now it's at this stage then that they actually put in their request to go back to the UK and to contribute to D-Day. And Kapansky, now Kapansky is identified in all the British books as the chief of staff, and clearly, as the commander-in-chief, and clearly he's not, it's Sosnkowski, but anyway, so his chief of staff to the commander-in-chief agrees, so that's fine. So the Polish paperwork's all in place. But the British say, well, no, our orders to kind of keep the commando troops where they are, so that they remain there. Now, if we move on then, here we have such good photos.
Just as a piece of art, that is an amazing photo.
Beautiful, isn't it? Absolutely. So we've got them here. So in theory, this is where the talk should end, because at this point then, April 1944, they transfer over to the 2nd Polish Corps under General Anders. Now, you might think, well, that's glorious. The Poles reunite with the Poles, but there's actually a degree of tension about this, as when the Carpathian Brigade sort of joins. The commandos have been used to sort of a degree of independence, and obviously that's going to sort of disappear to a degree. One of the really interesting things as well is that although a big deal is made out of the Poles in all the different theatres being sort of jointly Polish, and if you think, you read things like the the diaries of the 1st Polish Armored Division that are produced, and in them they've got lists of like naval victories, air force victories, and so forth. And you do have quite a lot of connection. You know, all of the sort of the troop newspapers have got news from all over the effort. The actual experience of the war has created these cultural differences. So in Italy, you've got these 3 groups. You've got the men who have passed through Siberia, survived through to the creation of the Anders Army, trained in the Middle East, and then passed through to Italy. You've got the Carpathian Brigade that formed in sort of North Africa and has, you know, been engaged in desert fight alongside the Allies throughout the war. And then you've got the Poles who've been up in Scotland. And obviously those are 3 very different experiences. Poles, bless them as a nation, we kind of engage in sort of, you know, trauma top trumps to a degree. But there's also sort of cultural differences. So I think it's the sort of the Siberian Poles, if we call them that, are quite sort of jokey about the Scottish Poles for their sort of the stiffness of their etiquette, for example. So it's these changes that we see sort of coming through.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's exactly how the high command, well, you can imagine their logic. Let's lump all the Poles together because they'll get on fine. And in a weird analogy, as a Brit living in France, French people assume every Brit who lives in France likes each other because what you don't. So some of them I do, some of them I don't want to settle. But there's an assumption that because we're all together in a country, we must be from a same group, and yet we're not. There's working class ones and posh ones and old ones. So I can completely understand why there'd be an assumption that, oh, they're Poles, they'll be fine. And yet actually there's these complete distinctions about where they're, not just their immediate ancestry in terms of what's happened, how they've got from 1939 to this point there, but just where they're from in Poland, their class, their region. It's there's much more nuance than we would first think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And coming back to your earlier point is this unit, they don't quite know what to do with them. So when we're looking at the sort of assault on Monte Cassino in May, Mrakovsky's then given control not just of his unit, but an assault squadron of the 15th Poznan Lancers, for example. So that's their role at Monte Cassino. Later, they then bring in the 111th Company. Now, this is very, very cool. These are actually Italian volunteers that want to fight against the Germans. And their official job is to protect the bridges. But they become much more of a sort of special forces unit. So it's Italians in Polish uniform with Polish officers. In July, then, they're sent to operate under the 2nd Polish Armoured Brigade. And then in August, their role changes completely when they become part of this much bigger formation, which is the Commando Motorized Battalion. And it's within this that they become a fight during the battle for Bologna. And now, by this point, they're no longer really this group of 100. It's become much more diluted. You've brought in lots of men with experience from North Africa. It's a much bigger force. So that sort of specifically British element has been diluted. So the Italian campaign, then, they're highly decorated, but they've got an 80% casualty rate. So they're you know, it's really quite significant. So I'm going to sort of begin to wrap up a little bit. I mean, whenever we do the polls, Woody, it never ends well. Oh, we've got another couple of shots here, sorry, from later in 45. Crossing the river here. Okay, so...
Oh, and just to interrupt you again, you know, we will at some point, you and I have discussed, we will be doing something hopefully on General Anders and the Italian campaign from the Polish point of view. It's so kind of watch this space, folks. But I just want to jump in because we get I know this next bit's going to be really important, but I've got a great question from Darren Little, who's one of your fans as well as being a fan of World War II TV, about any possible Jewish members of the Polish troop and whether at any point there were any, and did they not transfer to perhaps ex-troop?
As far as I know, I don't think so. That's where I'm up to. It's not something I've come across particularly. I mean, one of the interesting things actually about the German and the Austrian Jews who make up the bulk of ex-troop and the Polish Jews is, again, we've kind of got this idea that just because you're Jewish, you get on. And what we see actually after the war is you've got a very, very small Polish Jewish community that's served in the military. They set up their own kind of veterans association. But they end up sort of bringing in, I don't know if we did discuss this, they end up bringing in sort of Polish entertainers and Polish caterers. And they'd be trying to sort of reach out to the sort of the German Austrian sort of refugee groups. But actually, culturally, they're very different. They actually feel a close support to the Polish than the sort of the Jewish elements. So no, I haven't. I mean, that doesn't mean that somebody who was born in Poland didn't join. Gets incredibly messy on the ground, you know, with lots of sort of movement and immigration and marriage. But not to the best of my knowledge is where we're at with that. So yeah, okay. So these always end well for the Poles. So 1945, bit of a big year for the Poles. You've got Yalta, which kind of confirms Tehran, where the eastern section of Poland, at Stalin's instigation, and my God, could it ever be more relevant, is taken away to sort of boost the territories of Belarus and Ukraine. Which are not, you know, they had an independent existence before, whatever Putin says. Thanks, Darren. So, yeah, so that's taken away. A lot of the men, certainly in the Polish Second Corps, had come from Eastern Poland, so they can't go home. On top of that, you have the UK government transfers recognition from the London government in exile through to the communist-dominated government in Warsaw, which kind of leaves the Poles in this very sort of ambiguous situation in that they don't have official representation in the West. So what happens? The Brits then undertake this massive sort of social experiment, really. They create the Polish Resettlement Corps. About half of the 250,000 Poles that are serving under British command at the end of the war do return to Poland. But the rest are offered the opportunity to make a life in Britain. And to ease this transition, because there's big concerns, as there is at the end of any war, that you've suddenly got this big demobilized force, you're going to have employment pressures and so forth, as well as the fact that there's the language issue. And they will be in this sort of transitional state. So they'll take up the sort of the barracks that have been sort of vacated by the various sort of soldiers. And then they'll sort of pick up all these skills. So we've got a little case here. Now, you've got Mrakovsky on the right. Now, if I just read through the list of the awards that he is given. So he has the Silver Cross of the Order of Tutti Militari, has the Gold Cross, he has the Cross of Valor, he has the War Cross, the Croix de Guerre, and the Military Cross. At the end of the war, the top photo, he donates his Commando Beret to the Sikorsky Institute as kind of evidence of the Polish contribution to the Second World War. Okay, so we've got that. He is a man of status. He is important for the Poles. And then we've got this little article here from 1946. Polish mill workers. 4 Polish ex-servicemen, natives of Krakow, clearly not Krakow, and Łódź, who have accepted the British government's offer to settle in this country and become naturalised, have started work in the card and mule rooms of Mons Mill Todmorden. These men served with the Polish Commandos in Italy. Now, the good news is Mrakovsky's not one of them. He ends up working in a textile factory in Bradford with my grandfather, actually. So that's where he ends up. In 1951, then actually he moves to the US. He has the opportunity to emigrate. And we see him working in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, I think, until he sort of dies in the early 1960s. So as ever, we've got this story of this incredible escape through to the West, sort of serving above and beyond, and then this sort of fairly tragic sort of end, really. But that's kind of the Polish story, isn't it? In the second.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's kind of how your previous appearances have ended, and it is very, very tragic that there, alas, in these situations of people coming together in adversity, when the adversity is over, people forget the friendships they've acquired, and that seems to be the case. That, you know, as soon as World War II ended, everyone started hating the French and the Poles again and the Dutch, and everyone goes back to how it was before, and you know the cooperation goes away. And I was reminded of that famous quote that Alan Wood sent in the Daily Express in September 1944, when he said, "If in the years to come any man says to you, 'I fought at Arnhem,' take off your hat to him and buy him a drink, for this is the stuff of which England's greatness is made." So there you are. If you're an Arnhem veteran, in the war, after war, you've got a certain amount of clout. You can go into a pub. Not that I'm accusing Arnhem veterans of milking their experience, but you would have a certain level of respect. And if you say you were a Normandy veteran, or you're a commando, you're a Chindit, you're SAS, of course, these guys are dealing with PTSD and issues and things like that as well. But alas, it doesn't seem to be the same transitional period with people like the Poles. And I'm assuming if we were having a guest on talking about the French commandos, the Dutch commandos, and the Czech commandos, it would be a similar story.
I think potentially, except you've got the fact that the Poles are settling into the UK, which is widely seen. You know, a lot of them have spent like 2 years in Italy. They've lived, you know, first Polish armored divisions liberate these cities. They've been welcomed, and in Britain they are not. And some of that is pre-war xenophobia continuing. So a lot of them, you've got, you know, your sort of wartime trauma. And then you've got, you know, sort of all those sort of stressors. You know, you've got wartime marriages, you've got poverty, and so forth. That said, you get these moments where the British really do remember. So I remember my mum talking to me about the council house list. My family was given a council house in Bradford, and partly they were bumped up because the chap who was coordinating it had also fought at casino. And so Monte Cassino came up, and he found out that my grandfather had fought there. So you do have that sort of memory. I don't want to give away too much because it's kind of, you know, sort of like my PhD research, but you do have a lot of the post-war elite who professionally or personally have had contacts with the Poles, who do remember it. But on a day-to-day life, there's a kind of an assumption that they've come for a better life, that they're sort of economic migrants, and there's no real appreciation of what they've come through. So it's pretty sad.
And this is, you know, the ongoing discussion we have on this channel is it's important to look at this history not just through one national lens, but through other national lenses. And any books written in the 1950s about Number 10 in Allied Commando would have been written by British commando veterans, probably officers, and they would have written everything very much from a British point of view and an officer's upper class point of view. And it's about time now, nearly 80 years of historiography, to start examining the various forces through the national lens of their own country and how they were perceived by the other countries, and just start digging a little bit deeper. And that's what, thankfully, you're doing for us with your studies and your continued research into the Polish experience, which we universally thank you for. And you know, so, you know, what would be the next step in terms of studying the Polish troop? I mean, do you think there's something you would want to carry on researching? Have you obviously met some other people? Eric, whose father was in it, so there's obviously more to be found, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, you've kind of got the Polish troop experience, and then I think it's really interesting to then look at how it's then used 44, 45 under the Polish Second Corps. I mean, we've got, for example, assault squadrons, for example. You've got troops with experience in North Africa. It's how do they actually sort of mesh those different experiences together? I think that would be sort of a really sort of interesting sort of avenue, because if you talk about Polish commandos, most people from Polish background are thinking of that later period. The actual role that the Poles play, and yes, we're talking fewer than 100 men in the Inter-Allied Commando, is actually quite new. So you've kind of got this sort of switch between the British perspective that does know about the Inter-Allied Commando, and then the Polish side that knows much more about the sort of Italian campaign element. So yeah, how you sort of mesh what that training looks like is really interesting, I think.
Cool. And we got a question from Chris saying, what were your sources? Were Marek, and I'm going to butcher that, Wronski's books a source?
What are my sources? Yeah, I'm checking on my homework. Yeah, no, I mean, I've read a sort of range of books. I don't know.
I think he's asking for recommendations more than anything else. I think it's not an accusation. It's just that, you know, what sort of sources are available. I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, the best ones, if we're looking sort of English language, then you've got kind of your two about the sort of more general about the sort of inter-allied ones, for example. But you've got things like Lieutenant Chinsky's sort of account, for example, is sort of widely available, and so forth. So yeah, there's not a huge amount on the inter-allied element in English. because it's sort of part of the more sort of the general elements. Yeah.
And it was, and let's be honest, it was a smaller contingent. You know, I mean, some of the other special forces had a lot more men going through them, and so it's the information available has some connection to the size of the force in the first place. But yeah, we you were worried that we wouldn't have enough to fill out a show, but we filled out a show, and it's nice to do a bit of a shorter one. It goes well on YouTube. So thank you very much for your research. Really, I mean, it's just amazing stuff, and for all of us, just keep on singing the praises of the Polish and making us English speakers connect the dots on it, because it is something we have to do. Is we must keep looking at these stories from different points of view. That the one view narrative has to change, and it is changing, and it's good that it is.
I mean, can I just say, thank you so much for sort of giving me a platform to share this, because I mean, it's important that sort of that I think your audience appreciates the Poles, but I think it's quite nice from the Polish perspective, you know, certainly the sort of the British Poles, to have more of a sense of how it fits more generally into the sort of the Allied effort. It's quite easy to have a sense of, you know, your own family's story, but even what the other Poles were doing is quite interesting. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, I was out last year or the year before. We went to the Polish cemetery in Normandy, Colin, me and Mag, and how many more Polish visitors there are leaving comments in the visitors book there, who I'm assuming are mostly Poles, either living in France or the UK or something, because they don't necessarily say where they're from. And you look back over, and there's more going now than there perhaps were 5 and 10 years ago. So there is now a resurgence of interest, because people are moving around with work and things like that. It's good that people are coming to understand that the shared past that we all have, because that's ultimately what happened. All these nations were aiming in the same direction. I'm feeling I should say something topical about the events of the news, but I can't, because it just breaks my heart reading what we're reading about right now in the news, and everybody at each other's throats again. And we're talking about World War II, when a lot of people were aiming for the same thing, which was the removal of dictatorships. Anyway, it's a
I mean, if I can just build on that, I mean, it's been really interesting with a lot of the sort of the Polish Facebook groups and Twitter, is that Ukraine has brought back huge amounts of intergenerational trauma of packing your bags, of fleeing to the borders, of making that decision, of that powerlessness. There was a brilliant Timothy Garton Ash article today about, you know, it's making a direct comparison to Poland in 1939. Well, it's talking about, you know, we're asking for help and it's not being given. The major powers have their own priorities, for example, and that sense of abandonment. So and particularly, you know, with the sort of family links to Ukraine. I mean, my grandfather was born in Lviv, for example. So yeah, it's really, I think that is something that's kind of potentially lost, is that trauma that passes through. That, you know, when we look at the inter-allied troops, the Poles have a story that the other groups don't necessarily, and I think that does sort of continue.
Yeah, I mean, you know, but earlier in the week we were talking about the effectiveness and how do you rate, how do you score the achievements of special forces? Because sometimes it's kind of a propaganda thing, and you know, the forces we've talked about during the course of this week, the Americans and Canadians, for example, in the first Special Service Force, all the terrible combat they saw in Italy, at the very least, they knew their families were safe, because their families were in Canada or the USA, so they weren't worried about being bombed. If you're British, yes, your family could still be being bombed, depending on where you were. There are V1s and V2s, but if you're Polish and you're serving in Italy, you don't even maybe know where your family is. You may not know if they're even alive. When you start ranking and rating the successes or not of these units, just think about these people within them and how they're dealing with it as a human being. As you said there, that when they meet someone else from Poland, a sense of just connection of some kind of shared, you understand what we're going through, and when you're rating all these different units, understanding what they're going through as human beings, thinking about their families, I think is vital. Yeah,
absolutely. And then, I mean, you read, for example, Anders' autobiography. He's talking about it's the Army in Exile, and it's the political element. So you've got that personal element, but he's talking like, you know, February of 1944, when we were here before we go up against Casino, you know, we're already beginning to talk about sort of concerns about, whether Poland will be sold. Anders is very concerned about Churchill's position on maintaining Polish sovereignty. We get into sort of 1945, and you've got Yalta, for example, and your homeland's just been given. What in God's name are you fighting for? So there's Anders, Maciek again in Northwest Europe are both directly questioned as, will you keep fighting? It's
lots of deep discussions about that, and I think that's the best shows that we do are the ones where people, after having watched it, go away and just think about things and reconsider and think, I'd never thought of that perspective. I'd never thought of what it would be like to fight for the Allies when I'm uncertain about exactly what the Allies have in my interests, and whether do they care about my own personal self-improvement, so to speak, or do they just care about the bigger picture? No, we're going down a rabbit hole with this. But anyway, it's been fantastic talking to you. You didn't suffer too badly from the cold. So from all I can say is just I can't wait to have you back on the show again for the next deep dive into the Polish experience in World War II, because as I said, you are my go-to person now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. So I'll just remind people what we're coming up, and I'll say goodbye in a second. So, folks, don't forget 3 shows over the weekend. Tomorrow evening, Damien Lewis is on talking about the preparation and planning for Operation Biting, the Bruneval raid. Sunday afternoon, Neil Cherry is on talking about the actual Bruneval raid. And then Sunday evening, Jeffrey Cox is on talking about the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Java Sea. So given it's not 2022, we are covering all these 80th anniversary events, which is why I'm so damn busy all the time. But as usual, don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share what we're doing. And thank you for your company this evening. But right now, thank you very much, Jenny, for joining us. It's been fantastic. And I will see you next time. So cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.